So this week, you guys send in a ton of material about how ideas kind of take root and,
Hmm.
become meaningful in different settings. And it
Hmm.
really got us thinking
Yeah.
that what you're all exploring
Yeah.
really comes down to this idea of contextualization.
Right.
So we figured, let's take a deep dive into
Yeah,
what that really means.
absolutely.
You.
Yeah, and I think as your sources highlight,
Mm-hmm.
contextualization is
Mm-hmm.
really the art
Okay.
of making concepts and methods
Yeah.
really relevant
Right.
within a specific historical situation.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
the term itself comes from Latin,
Mm-hmm.
contextus, which
Mm.
means to weave together.
Oh, wow.
And I think what's so key here
Yeah.
is understanding how a core message,
Okay.
a central idea,
Right.
can maintain its integrity
Yeah.
while its presentation adapts and is woven into a new setting,
I see.
right?
Yeah, and this isn't just some abstract theory,
Yeah.
academics debating in some ivory tower.
Exactly.
One of the things that really jumped out at us from the material
Yeah.
was this move from indigenization, which
Yeah.
focused on
Yeah.
a movement being self-governing,
Right.
financially independent,
Mm-hmm.
and able to spread on its own
Yeah.
to this broader understanding of contextualization.
Wow.
And it seemed like,
Yeah.
especially in missiology, this was a pretty major shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
This idea that how do you ensure that a
Sure.
message
Yeah.
really resonates
Mhm.
with
Yeah.
different people in different cultures?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And while the specific term
Right.
contextualization may have become popular around
Yeah.
1972,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of tailoring a message
Right.
has been around
Yeah.
for ages.
Oh, for sure.
Like, if you think about it,
Yeah.
you can see this principle
Yeah.
at work
Mm.
way back.
And for sure. And your sources
Yeah.
give some really compelling examples, like right from the Bible.
Mhm.
Like you take the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay.
It seems pretty clear that it was written
Yeah.
with a Jewish audience in mind. Right?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating there
Hmm.
is the strong emphasis
Mm-hmm.
on prophecies
Yeah.
from the Old Testament
Yeah.
being fulfilled by Jesus.
Yeah.
And this focus on his lineage
Mm-hmm.
as the promised king.
Okay.
And then also, like,
Right.
the use of specific titles
Yeah.
for him,
Okay.
that would have held deep meaning for someone
Uh-huh.
familiar with Jewish scriptures and traditions.
I see. Yeah.
Like really speaking to that audience.
So then you've got
Mm.
John's Gospel,
Right.
which seems to take a different approach.
Yeah.
Really engaging with a Greek-speaking audience.
Yes, and a key example is John's use of the term logos.
Right.
This was a concept already circulating in Greek philosophy,
Yeah.
referring to something like,
Right.
the underlying reason
Yeah.
or order of the universe.
Okay.
But John taps into this familiar idea
Yeah.
and fundamentally redefines it,
Okay.
right? Saying that this logos
Right.
is actually the divine word.
Yeah.
And crucially,
Uh-huh.
that the word became flesh in
Oh.
Jesus.
Okay.
And this was a direct challenge to some Greek ideas
Right.
that saw a sharp divide
Yeah.
between the spiritual and the material,
Oh, I see. Okay,
Like
so it's like this real tightrope walk,
Right.
adapting the message so it connects,
Yeah.
but without losing
Mm.
what's essential.
Right.
And the Apostle Paul, it seems like he was a master
He truly was.
at navigating all these
Yeah.
different audiences.
Think about
Yeah.
his sermon in the synagogue in Antioch.
Okay.
Knowing he was speaking to a Jewish audience,
Mm.
he lays out the history of their people,
Right.
the patriarchs,
Yeah.
the prophets,
Yeah.
and showed how Jesus was the
Mhm.
culmination
Right.
of all those prophecies they had been waiting for.
Okay.
Right.
But then he goes to Athens.
Exactly.
Completely different crowd.
Totally.
The educated Gentile thinkers. And it's a
Yeah.
whole different ballgame.
It is a whole different ballgame. Yeah.
He doesn't start with
Yeah.
Abraham and the prophets there.
Right. He doesn't.
Right.
Instead, he finds a point of common ground.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Referencing their altar to the unknown God.
Right.
He even quotes lines
Wow.
from their own poets.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
He talks about God as the creator of all humanity,
Okay.
calls them to turn away from idols,
Mm-hmm.
speaks about a future judgment
Uh-huh.
and the resurrection of the dead,
Yeah.
a concept that, as the account tells us,
Okay.
some of them found pretty hard to believe.
Yeah. What's that?
I mean, what really stands out to me
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
Paul's core strategy was adapting
Mm-hmm.
how he presented
Right.
the message.
Yeah.
He famously said,
Yeah.
I try to become
Uh.
all things to all people,
Mm-hmm.
that by all means,
Yeah.
some might be saved.
Right.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
he was incredibly firm
Yes.
about the content.
That's such a crucial point to understand.
Yeah.
Right. He saw this necessity
Mm-hmm.
of making the message
Yeah.
understandable and relevant,
Oh.
but he never, ever
Yeah.
compromised the foundational truth
Right.
he believed in.
Right.
This tension between
Yeah.
being relevant and staying faithful
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely central
I see.
to this whole idea of contextualization.
Okay, so if we kind of jump forward
Mm-hmm.
a few centuries,
Yeah.
your sources point out that
Mm.
these contemporary discussions about contextualization,
Really took off
yeah,
after the 1960s. So what were the big factors
yeah, what was driving that?
driving that shift in thinking?
The main driving force, I would say,
Okay.
was this growing realization
Yeah.
among leaders in
Oh.
churches
Okay.
around the world,
Uh-huh.
not just in Western countries, but
Okay.
also in Africa,
Yeah.
Asia,
Mm-hmm.
Latin America,
Right.
that the theological frameworks
Okay.
and the methods
Mm-hmm.
of spreading the Christian faith
Right.
that had originated in the West
Mm-hmm.
weren't always connecting effectively
Okay.
with the unique cultural and social realities
Yeah.
of their own regions.
It's almost like trying to speak a language,
Precisely.
where the
Yeah.
grammar and the basic assumptions just don't translate.
Uh-huh.
The core information might be there,
Yeah.
but it's not really being understood as
Yeah.
intended.
And there was also this growing awareness
Right.
that all systems of belief,
Yeah.
all theologies,
Mm-hmm.
even those that had become dominant in the West,
Okay.
are shaped
Hmm.
to some extent by the cultures.
Right.
They emerge from, no theological framework exists
Right.
in a vacuum, completely untouched by its surroundings.
So this growing awareness led to a lot of important international conversations.
Uh-huh.
And your sources detail a number of
Yeah.
really key consultations.
Yeah.
So let's start by looking at what was happening in Africa.
Okay.
What were some of the early discussions there?
Some of the earliest organized efforts
Okay.
to grapple with these issues
Mm-hmm.
took place in Africa.
Right.
The conference in Ghana in 1955,
Yeah.
for example,
Okay.
occurred at a time when
Yeah.
new independent churches
Okay.
were forming.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Okay.
these new expressions
Okay.
blended Christian beliefs
Yeah.
with traditional African practices,
Ah.
what's often referred to as syncretism.
Uh-huh.
And there was a real concern
Okay.
to understand how Christianity
Yeah.
could be authentically African
Right. Right.
without losing its core identity.
Okay. So then the 1965 consultation in Ibadan, Nigeria,
Absolutely.
seems to have been a really significant moment as well.
So in Ibadan,
Yeah.
African theologians themselves
Okay.
started to reflect deeply on the relationship
Mhm.
between the Christian gospel
Right.
and their own pre-Christian cultural traditions.
Okay.
So they were wrestling with these questions of
Hmm.
continuity and discontinuity.
All right.
Where could they find common ground?
Yeah.
Where was there a fundamental difference?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They wanted to figure out how the message of Scripture
Mm-hmm.
could be expressed authentically
Uh-huh.
within indigenous African cultural forms.
Okay. And the 1972 meeting at Maker University in Uganda
Right.
sounds particularly interesting,
Yeah.
especially with the deliberate exclusion of
Yeah.
theologians from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds.
Yeah. So what's so striking about Maker
Mm.
is this explicit focus
Oh, yeah.
on developing African theology and church life,
Right.
specifically in the context of modern African society,
Mm-hmm.
both in urban centers and rural areas.
Okay.
So the decision to exclude Anglo scholars
Right.
and the presence of representatives from the Black Power movement
Wow.
really underscored this desire
Okay.
for theological self-determination,
Uh-huh.
a real pushback against
Yeah.
the historical dominance of Western theological thought.
So several key questions kept coming up
Yeah.
in these African conferences, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
This role of the Old Testament in African Christian thought.
Right.
The place of traditional African religion.
Exactly.
Right.
And they grappled with questions like,
Right.
does African theology need to engage deeply
Mm-hmm.
with the Old Testament? How should they understand traditional African religious beliefs and practices?
Mm.
Are they completely incompatible with Christianity?
Cool.
Or are there points of connection?
Right.
You know, and that core question
Mm.
of continuity versus discontinuity
Right.
was constantly being revisited.
And then there's this really important question of
Right.
who gets to
Yeah.
define all this.
That brings up a crucial point about the insider versus outsider.
Yeah.
Dynamic and contextualization.
Right.
And then, of course,
Yeah.
the rapid changes happening in African societies due to urbanization
Right.
also played a major role in shaping how theology
Yeah.
needed to be relevant to people's everyday lives.
Okay.
You know.
So then shifting over to Latin America,
Okay.
the Iglesia y Sociedad, or ISIL movement in Brazil,
Right.
seems to have been an early and influential voice in these discussions.
So what's particularly interesting about ISIL, which began in 1962,
Okay.
is their focus on
Yeah.
interpreting
Yeah.
the specific social and political realities of Latin America
Right.
through theological reflection.
Yeah.
You know, touching on themes like
Right.
history, human rights, and the nature of the church.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
they also made use of Marxist analysis
Okay.
to understand social inequalities.
Right.
And this later led to concerns
Okay.
among some
Yeah.
about the movement becoming too politically radicalized.
So using Marxist analysis as a lens to interpret scripture.
Yeah.
You know, seeing stories like the Exodus primarily through the lens of
Right.
political liberation.
It is, and as your sources point out,
Right.
some Latin American theologians
Yes.
like René Padilla
Okay.
felt that ISIL was in danger of moving beyond,
Okay.
you know, offering a Christian perspective on social change and potentially becoming
Right.
too aligned
Yeah.
with specific revolutionary ideologies.
I see. So then on the evangelical side in Latin America,
Right.
the emergence of the Fraternidad Teologica Latinoamericana, or FTL,
Absolutely.
seems like a really important counterpoint.
Starting in 1971,
Okay.
the FTL represented an effort by evangelical Christians in Latin America
Right.
to engage with this need for contextualization
Yeah.
while also emphasizing the authority of Scripture
Right.
as their primary guide.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted to develop a theology that was both deeply rooted in the Bible
Okay.
and directly relevant to the specific experiences and challenges
Right.
of churches in Latin America.
Okay, so these regional conversations were clearly vital,
Yeah.
but the discussion also broadened to a global level with the World Council of Churches, and the Uppsala Assembly in 1968
Yeah.
is mentioned as laying some important groundwork.
Yes, Uppsala was a key moment
Yeah.
in bringing these concerns to a wider international audience.
Right.
You know, documents addressing
Yeah.
world economic and social development
Yeah.
and towards justice and peace and international affairs
Okay.
really highlighted the church's responsibility
Right.
to
Yeah.
engage with the
Yeah.
pressing social and political issues of the time and to apply biblical principles
Right.
to these modern challenges.
I see.
Right.
And then the Bossi consultation in 1971 took a more focused look
Yeah.
at how this rapidly advancing technology
Right.
was impacting theological thinking.
So what's fascinating there
Yeah.
is this recognition
Okay.
that
Yeah.
the swift social changes brought about by technology
Right.
were posing new questions
Right.
that traditional systematic theology was struggling to answer.
I see.
And a paper by A.O. Dyson
Okay.
titled Dogmatic or Contextual Theology became a central point of discussion.
Okay.
And it really contrasted
Yeah.
theological approaches that start with established doctrines and those that begin with the realities and issues of the contemporary world.
So essentially, Dyson argued,
Exactly.
you know, that a more contextual approach was necessary
Yeah.
because traditional theology just wasn't adequately addressing these new ethical and social dilemmas.
He pointed out that
Right.
while traditional theology often draws on
Okay.
revelation, scripture, and established traditions,
Right.
contextual theology starts by looking at the data and the problems
Yeah.
of the secular world.
Okay. And the Ministry in Context report
Absolutely.
from the Theological Education Fund
Yeah.
also played a really significant role
Yeah.
in shaping this conversation.
The TIEF's goal was to reform
Okay.
how people were being trained for Christian ministry. by specifically focusing on contextualizing the gospel in response to what they saw as crises of faith, social injustice, and the tensions arising from the interaction of local cultures with global technology.
Right.
And they even provided funding to support initiatives that aim to do this. So the term contextualization really gained wider usage and influence through this report.
So then we have the Lausanne movement in 1974, which represented a major engagement with this topic.
Lausanne was pivotal in bringing this concept of contextualization to the forefront of evangelical thinking on a global scale. And Bancato's presentation on the gospel, cultural context, and the dangers of syncretism really raised crucial questions about how to distinguish the core message of Christianity from its various cultural expressions.
And there were specific seminars at Lausanne that focused on contextualization in different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even in more westernized Anglo-Saxon cultures. And these regional seminars really delved into the specific challenges and opportunities for making the gospel relevant in a wide range of cultural settings. You know, and Lausanne raised some fundamental questions about how the gospel interacts with culture, questions that would continue to be explored in later discussions. So your sources highlight the ongoing work of the Latin American Theological Fraternity and the emergence of the Willowbank group as important developments that followed Lausanne.
So the FTL continued to develop their thinking. Particularly in response to the rise of liberation theologies. You know, really striving to articulate a theological framework that was both biblically sound and relevant to the specific realities of Latin America and the Willowbank group. In their 1979 consultation, specifically focused on this intricate relationship between the gospel and culture. Critically examining how the gospel is communicated across cultural boundaries. And even acknowledging the ways in which culture itself influences how we understand the Bible.
So the Willowbank report actually laid out different ways of approaching the Bible, what they called popular, historical, and contextual approaches, and argued for this contextual approach, which takes into account both the original context of Scripture and the present cultural context.
What's so significant about Willowbank is their attempt to find a solid biblical basis for the idea of contextualization, pointing to examples like the incarnation of Jesus and Paul's adaptable approach in his ministry. They emphasize the importance of distinguishing between the essential meaning of the gospel and its cultural forms of expression. You know, identifying the core heart of the gospel and also affirming the positive aspects that can be found within different cultures. They even suggested the idea of dynamic equivalence. Communicating the message in a way that has a similar impact in the new cultural context as it did in the original. This really expanded the evangelical conversation by acknowledging this two-way influence between culture and Scripture.
So it sounds like there were these different streams of thought emerging even within this broader evangelical engagement. You know, with some advocating for a more thorough engagement with the surrounding culture. That's fair.
Thinkers like Padilla and Escobar felt this need to move beyond some of those initial discussions and push for a deeper and more meaningful interaction with the cultural context while still firmly upholding the ultimate authority of Scripture.
I see.
So their dialogical models of contextualization really represent this more profound engagement.
And North America also became a significant part of this conversation with conferences like the Theology in the Americas Gathering in Detroit in 1975.
What was unique about the Detroit Conference was its inclusion of voices and perspectives from industrialized Western countries. Not just what was then termed the Third World as important context for theological reflection.
Okay.
So it also specifically included minority groups within those Western countries as active participants in shaping theological understanding.
Right.
And it focused on critically examining the tools being used for analyzing social and cultural contexts.
Okay.
Right.
And there were also specific evangelical consultations in North America that looked at contextualization, primarily from the perspective of those involved in foreign missions. So the Evangelical Foreign Missions Association Executives Retreat in 1974 aimed to develop practical guidelines for applying theology in different cultural settings while avoiding the dangers of syncretism and the consultation on theology and mission at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in 1979 also made significant contributions. Okay.
With various papers exploring New Testament examples of contextualization and different aspects of the process itself.
Okay, so looking back at all